The marble floor gleamed under the crystal chandelier as James Mitchell adjusted his night guard uniform, watching the billionaire stride past him like he didn't exist. But what happens when the invisible man in the lobby becomes the only thing standing between life and death? Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be completely overlooked, dismissed as worthless by someone who measures human value in dollar signs, only to become their unexpected savior in the darkest moment? The air was thick with expensive cologne and arrogance as Victor Ashford, the tech mogul worth $12 billion, sneered at the security guard who dared to ask for his identification, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor like a countdown to humiliation. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the shadows held secrets that would change everything. James had spent 15 years as a covert operative before trading his tactical gear for a simple blue uniform and a name tag, choosing anonymity over acclaim, choosing peace over the adrenaline rush of international espionage. But some skills never fade and some instincts never sleep, especially when you've been trained to read micro-expressions and spot threats in crowded rooms where everyone wears a mask of civility. The billionaire's words cut through the lobby like shards of glass, calling James pathetic, a nobody, a failure who couldn't amount to anything more than checking badges at midnight, yet as those cruel words hung in the air, a figure emerged from the parking garage with a concealed weapon and murder in his eyes, targeting the very man who had just finished his tirade of superiority. In that split second between recognition and action, James moved with the fluid precision of a ghost, neutralizing the threat before anyone even registered danger, his movements so smooth and calculated that the billionaire found himself staring at his savior through tears of shock and newfound understanding, realizing that the man he'd dismissed as invisible had just saved not only his life, but the lives of his wife and daughter waiting in the penthouse above. And if you want to witness more incredible stories of hidden heroes and life-changing moments, hit that subscribe button now. The weight of Victor Ashford's contempt still hung in the air like poisonous fog as James Mitchell's trained eyes tracked the assailant's approach through the lobby's reflective surfaces, calculating distance, speed, and the exact moment of interception while maintaining the facade of a humble security guard checking his clipboard. Because years of deep cover operations in hostile territories had taught him that the element of surprise was worth more than any weapon. The attacker moved with amateur determination, his hand trembling slightly as it reached for the gun tucked beneath his jacket, clearly someone with a personal vendetta rather than a professional hit, which made him more dangerous in some ways because desperate men don't follow patterns. They act on pure emotion and rage that James recognized from countless missions where he'd witnessed how quickly love could transform into lethal intent. Victor Ashford continued his phone conversation about a hostile takeover worth hundreds of millions, completely oblivious to death approaching from his blind spot, his arrogance creating a bubble of false security that James had seen shatter too many times in Beirut, Moscow, and Bangkok, where powerful men believed their wealth made them invincible until reality came calling with a bullet or blade. The attacker was now 20 feet away, his breathing accelerated, pupils dilated with adrenaline. The classic physiological markers James had been trained to identify at Langley during those grueling months of preparation before his first assignment to eliminate an arms dealer in Venezuela. And muscle memory took over as James dropped his clipboard with calculated clumsiness, bending down at precisely the right angle to obscure his next movement from the security cameras he knew recorded everything in 4-second loops. In one fluid motion that appeared to observers like an old man stumbling, James swept the attacker's legs while simultaneously redirecting the gun's trajectory toward the ceiling, the suppressed shot barely audible over the lobby's ambient music. And before the would-be assassin could process what happened, James had him unconscious with a blood choke that looked like he was simply helping a drunk patron who'd collapsed, all while maintaining the appearance of a confused night guard just trying to help. Victor Ashford's face transformed from annoyance to shock to something James hadn't expected. raw, primal fear mixed with the dawning realization that death had been 3 seconds away. And the tears that followed weren't just from shock, but from the sudden understanding that his wealth, his power, his entire empire meant nothing in that moment when only the quick actions of a man he'd called worthless had prevented his wife from becoming a widow and his daughter from growing up without a father, creating a silence in the lobby so profound that even the gentle hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause in reverence to the gravity of what had just transpired. The lobby security footage would later show nothing more than a minor medical incident, expertly edited by James, who knew exactly which angles to avoid and how to position bodies to create false narratives, a skill acquired during 3 years undercover in Damascus, where every movement had to tell 2 stories simultaneously. But right now, Victor Ashford stood frozen, his $12 billion empire suddenly feeling like worthless paper, as he stared at the unconscious attacker being discreetly zip-tied with supplies from James's utility belt that held far more than anyone suspected. "You need to call your wife," James said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd delivered similar messages to presidents and generals. "Tell her you'll be late but safe. Don't mention what happened until the police finish their investigation." And Victor's trembling fingers could barely dial the number as the reality crashed over him that this minimum wage guard possessed a calmness in crisis that his entire security team of former Navy SEALs had never demonstrated. The attacker began to stir, muttering about Victor's hostile takeover of his father's company, the bankruptcy that followed, the suicide that destroyed a family. And James recognized the pattern from Prague, Cairo, and dozens of other cities where he'd witnessed how corporate warfare created real casualties, real blood that never showed up in quarterly reports or board meetings, but manifested in moments like this where grief transformed into violence. "His name is Marcus Chen," James said, reading the driver's license with eyes that had memorized 10,000 faces in terrorist databases. "Son of David Chen, whose manufacturing company you acquired and stripped for parts 6 months ago." And Victor's face went pale as James continued with details no simple security guard should know about offshore accounts, shell companies, and the systematic destruction of a family business that had employed 300 people for 40 years. The police sirens were still 5 minutes out, plenty of time for James to explain how he'd noticed Marcus casing the building for 3 weeks, following patterns, learning schedules, waiting for this exact moment when Victor always left late on Thursdays after video calls with Hong Kong, information James had gathered not through security briefings, but through the same observational skills that once helped him identify a sleeper cell in London by the way they avoided certain subway routes. "Why didn't you report him?" Victor whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension, and James's response was simple, yet devastating. "Because men like you don't listen to men like me until the gun is already pointed at your head, until your mortality becomes more real than your stock portfolio, until you realize that the invisible people you step over every day are the same ones who keep your world from falling apart while you sleep in your penthouse, dreaming of acquisitions and mergers that destroy lives you'll never bother to count." Victor's tears came harder now as James handed him a handkerchief from his pocket, the same pocket that once held cyanide pills and encrypted communication devices. And in that moment, the billionaire understood that his salvation hadn't come from his wealth or connections, but from a man who chose to save him despite every insult, every dismissive glance, every moment of deliberate humiliation, proving that true power isn't measured in net worth, but in the split-second decision to protect even those who wouldn't protect you. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell struck midnight, marking not just a new day but a transformation that would forever change how Victor Ashford saw the invisible guardians who stood watch in the shadows of his glittering empire. The weight of Marcus Chen's unconscious body seemed to press down on the marble floor as Victor fumbled with his phone, calling his private security team who were mysteriously absent tonight, a detail James had noticed 3 hours earlier when the usual Mercedes didn't arrive, when the encrypted radio frequencies went silent, when the pattern of protection that cost $2 million annually simply vanished like smoke. And now the billionaire was beginning to understand that this wasn't random. This was orchestrated, planned by someone who knew exactly how to create vulnerabilities in supposedly impenetrable defenses. "Your head of security, Richardson, he's been compromised," James said, pulling up surveillance footage on his phone, with an app that definitely didn't come standard with security guard training, showing Richardson meeting with known corporate saboteurs at a warehouse in Queens, accepting payment that traced back to competitors who wanted Victor vulnerable, exposed, ready to be acquired or eliminated, whichever came first and cost less. The revelation hit Victor harder than any physical blow as James continued scrolling through evidence he'd been collecting for months, not because anyone asked him to, not because he was still active in any agency, but because old habits die hard. And when you've spent years preventing international incidents, you can't help but notice when domestic ones are brewing right under your nose, especially when innocent people might get caught in the crossfire of billionaire ego wars. "They were going to frame Marcus for your murder," James explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen similar operations in Mogadishu, Caracas, and Kiev. "Use his legitimate grief as cover for a professional hit. Let him take the fall while your company gets carved up by vultures who've been circling since your last acquisition, and your wife and daughter would have been collateral damage, loose ends to be tied up in what the media would call a tragedy, but what your competitors would call a successful market adjustment." Victor's hands shook as he absorbed the magnitude of what James was revealing, how this night guard making $15 an hour had unraveled a conspiracy that his million-dollar security consultants had missed, how this man he'd called worthless had been conducting counter-surveillance operations between checking employee badges and monitoring parking garage cameras, building a case that would have made federal prosecutors weep with joy if they knew it existed. "The real shooter is still out there," James said, checking his watch with the precision of someone who'd synchronized operations across time zones. "Probably in position on the Whitman building across the street, waiting for police to arrive and create chaos, waiting for you to step outside into his crosshairs, thinking the danger is past. But we're not going to give him that satisfaction, are we, Victor?" The question hung between them like a challenge as James pulled out a second phone, this one definitely not store-bought, and began typing commands that rerouted security cameras, triggered false fire alarms in adjacent buildings, and created a maze of confusion that would make any sniper abandon their position, skills that belonged in Langley or Fort Meade, not in the lobby of a Manhattan high-rise where a security guard was supposedly just earning minimum wage to watch monitors and sign visitors in after hours. The sirens began their distant wail as Victor watched James work with the efficiency of a man who'd once coordinated extraction teams in hostile territories, his fingers dancing across keyboards that materialized from hidden panels in the security desk, panels Victor had walked past 1,000 times without knowing they concealed equipment that belonged in a CIA safe house, not a corporate lobby where champagne receptions and hostile takeovers were supposed to be the only battles fought. "Your daughter Sarah, she's at the Ritz-Carlton with her friends for her birthday party," James said without looking up, information he shouldn't have known, couldn't have known unless he'd been monitoring not just threats but protecting people who didn't even know they needed protection. "And your wife is at the charity gala at the Met. Both locations have been compromised. Teams are moving on them now, but I've already activated countermeasures that will seem like coincidences. A kitchen fire that evacuates the hotel, a power outage that ends the gala early, keeping them safe without them ever knowing they were targets." The revelation that this man had been guardian angel to his family, while Victor had treated him like furniture, like something less than human, brought tears that the billionaire hadn't shed since his father's funeral. Tears that carried the weight of shame and gratitude, and the crushing realization that everything he thought he knew about power and protection had been an illusion maintained by someone he'd never bothered to learn the name of until tonight. "Why?" Victor asked, his voice breaking on the single word that contained a universe of confusion, wondering why someone with James's skills would choose this life, choose to be invisible, choose to endure daily humiliation from people who weren't worth a fraction of what he was. And James finally looked up, his eyes carrying the weight of operations in Kandahar where children became casualties, of missions in Damascus where collateral damage had names and faces that haunted dreams. Because real protection means being where no one expects you, James replied, standing now as police vehicles screeched to a halt outside. It means swallowing pride to maintain cover. It means letting billionaires call you worthless while you're preventing their children from becoming orphans. And sometimes it means that the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone ignores, the one who chose obscurity over acclaim, because he'd seen what happens when ego drives operations and innocent people pay the price. The police burst through the doors with weapons drawn, but James had already laid out evidence so perfectly packaged that prosecutors would later call it the most airtight case they'd ever seen. Surveillance footage, financial records, communication intercepts, all tied with digital ribbons that led straight to the real conspirators while protecting Marcus Chen from false charges, giving him the psychiatric help he needed instead of a prison cell he didn't deserve. And as Victor was escorted to safety, he turned back to see James returning to his desk, adjusting his uniform, becoming invisible again. But now Victor knew the truth that would change him forever, that heroes don't always wear capes or badges. Sometimes they wear name tags and minimum wage uniforms, choosing to protect those who would never know their names. And in that moment, Victor made a decision that would reshape his entire empire. But that's a story for another night, another revelation, another moment when the invisible become invaluable. The transformation began the very next morning when Victor Ashford arrived at his corporate headquarters, not in his usual Bentley, but walking through the main entrance like any other employee, stopping at James's desk with 2 cups of coffee and a conversation that would ripple through the building like an earthquake dressed in whispers. Because when a $12 billion man sits on the floor of a lobby eating breakfast with a security guard, the world tilts on its axis, and everything people thought they knew about hierarchy crumbles into dust. "I've been thinking about what you said," Victor began, his voice carrying none of its usual command, but instead the tentative notes of someone learning to speak a new language, the language of humility, about being where no one expects you, about real power being invisible. And I realized I've built an empire, but I've been blind to the foundation, blind to the people who actually keep it standing, people like you who've been protecting not just my body, but my soul from becoming something monstrous. James listened while monitoring 12 different security feeds simultaneously, his fingers occasionally tapping commands that rerouted a suspicious delivery or flagged an employee whose behavioral patterns suggested insider trading, all while maintaining the appearance of just another guard drinking morning coffee. Because even now, even with Victor knowing the truth, maintaining cover was essential to protecting the hundreds of people who worked in this building without knowing their guardian angel wore a uniform they walked past without seeing. "There's something else," Victor continued, pulling out a folder that contained government documents, classified files that his connections had managed to acquire through channels that cost more than most people's houses. "Your last mission, the one in Prague where the ambassador's family was saved, but you were burned by your own agency for refusing to follow orders that would have caused civilian casualties. They destroyed your reputation, made you unemployable in any official capacity. But I want to offer you something different, not a job, but a partnership, a chance to build something that operates in the shadows but protects the innocent, funded by my resources but guided by your principles." The offer hung in the air like a bridge between 2 worlds, the billionaire's realm of public power and James's universe of invisible protection. And for the first time in 5 years, James allowed himself to consider stepping partially out of the shadows, not into the spotlight but into a twilight zone where he could expand his operations, save more lives, prevent more tragedies, all while maintaining the cover that had become not just his shield but his identity. "On one condition," James finally responded, his eyes never leaving the security monitors even as his mind calculated the possibilities. I remain the night guard. I keep this position, this desk, this uniform, because the moment I become visible, the moment I become somebody, is the moment I lose the ability to be everywhere and nowhere, to be the ghost that keeps the monsters at bay. And that's a price I won't pay, not even for $12 billion of resources. And Victor nodded, understanding finally that true power wasn't about being seen, but about seeing everything, about being dismissed while being indispensable, about saving lives while being called worthless. And as they shook hands over that simple security desk, a partnership was born that would eventually save thousands of lives. But none of that would ever be known, because the best stories, the most important stories, are the ones that never make headlines. The partnership that began over coffee in that marble lobby would reshape not just Victor's empire, but the very fabric of how power protected the powerless, as James orchestrated a network of invisible guardians across the city, former operatives who had been discarded by their governments now working as janitors, delivery drivers, maintenance workers, each one positioned perfectly to prevent tragedies before they happened, funded by Victor's billions, but answering only to James's moral compass that never wavered even when the price of doing right meant staying wrong in the eyes of the world. 6 months later, when Victor's daughter was unknowingly targeted by human traffickers who had infiltrated her university, it was the campus custodian, one of James's network, who prevented her abduction while everyone else saw just another immigrant pushing a mop bucket. And when Victor's wife's charity gala was infiltrated by terrorists posing as catering staff, it was the parking attendant who neutralized the threat before the first champagne glass could become a weapon, because James had learned that evil often hides behind privilege while heroes disguise themselves as the help. The night guard still sits at his desk, still checks badges, still endures the occasional sneer from those who measure worth in stock portfolios. But now when he taps his keyboard, he's coordinating rescue operations in 12 countries. When he adjusts his uniform, he's activating a communication network that has saved more lives than any government agency. And when he looks through those who look through him, he sees everything they're too important to notice, protects everyone who's too powerful to realize they need protection, because the greatest guardians are the ones who never need recognition, never seek glory, never demand respect. They just stand watch in the shadows, invisible and invaluable, forgotten and unforgettable.